Hi there, we're here for class 20, uh, Tuesday, November 23rd. It's snowy out, which is kind of exciting. Spent some nice time out this morning feeding the birds, which is one of my many pastimes, particularly in the pandemic, but I've also always been sort of a bird fan. This is Tuesday, the end of week 10. I'm feeling better than I was last week, and the COVID test came back negative, so that's a good thing. It's probably just a touch of bronchitis, which I have had before. So I am feeling better. Thank you to those who sent me well wishes. That was unexpected and very nice. So pardon me if I cough. My voice is not quite up to snuff, but we'll try to get through today. Today's lecture should be about 70 minutes. You have about 10 minutes of video to watch. And actually today is reasonably straightforward stuff. Simplified, but reasonably straightforward. Today we're going to be looking at the counter-reform. In lecture 19, we looked at the reform, and today we're going to be looking at the counter-reform, which are those responses to reform. Now, reform and counter-reform are also responses to the Haskalah, the Enlightenment and Emancipation, which came before. Reform was a response to the Haskalah, and counter-reform was, in a sense, a response to the reform, but also a response to emancipation. So we've done the emancipation, we've done the Enlightenment, we've done the reform, and now we're going to be doing the counter-reform. I'm Holly, or Dr. Pierce, whatever you prefer. My office hours for this course are Thursdays at 4. Unfortunately, I had to cancel my office hours last week because I wasn't feeling well. But I should be good to go this week. And you can also email me at any time. If Thursdays at 4 doesn't work for you, we can set up a different time. Okay, so class 19 was reform. Class 20 is going to be looking at counter-reform. Before that, we looked at the Enlightenment and the Emancipation. So these are the most important developments within Judaism as a religion in the modern era. They are effectively what makes Judaism from the medieval age develop into the Judaisms that we see today, particularly, of course, Rabbinic Judaism. All forms of Rabbinic Judaism that you see today are products of the Haskalah, Emancipation, Enlightenment, Reform, and Counter-Reform in some way or another. A lot of these developments, as we talk about them, we are focusing quite a lot on Europe. But these kinds of trends are happening all around the world, and they have certainly since affected all forms of Rabbinic Judaism that we see today. There is no one Judaism that represents a uninterrupted, unchanged continuity from the Middle Ages. Okay, so when we talk about Judaism, we talk about ancient Judaism, we talk about post-Babylon, the Judaism of the post-Babylon exile into the Second Temple period, and then we have this big disruption with the fall of the Temple and the beginning of the Great Diaspora. Then we have the advent of Rabbinic Judaism, other forms of Rabbinic Judaism remain, like Karaite Judaism, but then we have the development of Rabbinic Judaism in the early Great Diaspora, from 70 CE, the fall of the Temple, into 200 when the Mishnah is recorded, and then into 500, 600 as the Talmud develops, and into the Middle Ages. So then we have medieval Judaism, as we looked at. It's fairly coherent. Rabbinic Judaism has cultural flavors, but is largely quite unified throughout the Middle Ages. And in the modern era, it's the era of denominations. And so this is where we are in the course so far, and we're going to be looking today at the denominations that grow out of the counter-reform. So the reform was an attempt to modernize Judaism to effectively make sort of a Protestant Judaism, to use that term, a Judaism that is focused on personalism and on modernity and on allowing Jews to take full advantage of the emancipation. And the Counter-Reform are largely denominations that could not agree to the changes that reformers were making. Okay, so you've had a couple of readings to do for today. Please do the readings. This stuff is really complex, and these lectures cannot reflect all of the complexities that you will find in the readings. So it is quite important to do the readings as we go along. You will get a fuller education on this. Hopefully that's important to you. Okay, so in the modern age, Judaism of modernity is a denominational religion, which means that there are multiple varieties of variations on the same core faith, people who generally recognize each other to be co-religionists, but who disagree on some fundamental issues, making it necessary to create different versions of the same religion. When we talk about the denominations of Judaism, we're largely talking about Orthodoxy, Conservative, and Reform. Those are the major denominations of today. We also have what we call ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Judaism. We also have Reconstructionist Judaism. Those two we'll talk a bit about today. We also have some really quite extremely progressive forms like Liberal Judaism, which we talked about, I believe, last class, and secular Judaisms and humanistic Judaisms, which we'll be looking at in an upcoming class. And others, okay? So there are a number of denominations, and in some regards there are a few sects, which are generally discussed as people who aren't recognized as even practicing the same religion anymore, or who do not recognize other Jews as practicing the same religion. Okay, it is important to note that non-rabbinic forms of Judaism still exist today. We particularly see this with the ongoing existence of Karaite Judaism, but also we also have, as we discussed last class, the presence of post-Talmudic Judaism. That is Judaism that grows out of the rabbinic tradition. That is the heritage of most of the people engaged in post-Talmudic Judaism, but who believe that Talmud is no longer binding, and have largely returned to Torah and consider Talmud sort of part of their heritage, but no longer binding. Traditional stance, like the Orthodox and not even the Haredi, these are not direct developments from medieval Judaism. They have been created through the Reform and Counter-Reform period. Haredi Judaism is often recognized as, or often described as, ultra-traditional, as somehow not being changed by time, but it certainly is, has been changed by time. And not the least by which Haredi Judaism was more or less grows out of the conflict between the Hasidic movements and the Mitnagdim in the 1600s, and then their reunification of the Mitnagdim and the Hasidim in light of the Reform. So all of these forms of Judaism have been changed by history, regardless of how people might describe them in terms of their traditionality or their authenticity or anything of that nature. Most forms of Judaism maintain the centrality of God and Torah to some extent, but their approach to Torah can be different, whether or not they believe that Torah is divinely written, that Moses wrote the Torah as dictated by God, or whether they believe that the Torah is divinely inspired and human made, or whether they simply see the Torah as an important historical document for the history of Jewish civilization. Approaches to halakha and Talmudic halakha is also different, whether they consider the Talmud and halakha to be binding or whether they consider it to be optional. Whether they consider rituals or faith to be most important, how they view modern Zionism, which is an ideology we have yet to look at. We'll look at that, I think, in class 23. And the place of Israel, whether Israel is considered to be sort of metaphorical or whether it is actually considered to be focused on the geographic place. And again, as we saw with the developments within the Reform movement, these things are also, they also change over time. The Reform movement was originally a rejection of real geographical or political Zionism, as Reform Jews, Reform leaders were eager to convince local authorities that Jews could be good citizens in America or Germany or wherever. They chose to read Israel purely as metaphorical at that time, but the Reform movement has since changed a lot of their policies on Zionism to actually include real political, historical Zionism. Don't worry if that doesn't make a lot of sense. We'll talk in class 23, we'll look at the differences between metaphorical Zionism and sort of real political Zionism and what that means. And finally, the different denominations have different understandings of Jewishness. According to traditional rabbinic Judaism, only those who are born to a Jewish mother or who have converted according to an acceptable authority can be considered Jewish. But this has become much more flexible along the spectrum. For example, for Reform Jews, most Reform congregations accept people born of either a Jewish mother or a Jewish father. And this was a measure to react to the increased rates of intermarriage, because as many Jews marry non-Jews today as who marry Jews, but it's about 50-50. So in the Reform movement, it was understood, or it's decided that we cannot simply lose all of the children born to a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. We have to be more inclusive in order to keep those children within Judaism if their families want them to stay within Judaism. So we get a lot of variation on different important key aspects to Judaism, but the central core remains: focus on God, some relevance of Torah, and some relevance on Israel, no matter in whatever way the community happens to define it. So when we're talking about the counter-reform, that's the Reform, obviously, and these kind of grow out as counter-reform denominations. So how did the counter-reform leaders, thinkers, followers, congregations in general, what was their general idea of modernity? Because as we've seen, modernity presents challenges and opportunities. The emancipation was incredibly important to the health and well-being of Jews. The stuff that we were looking at in the Middle Ages was pretty horrific. So emancipation represented enormous opportunity to the Jews for safety, for health and happiness, for a living income, the ability to not only birth children, but raise them to adulthood and to see them established in some kind of healthy life. These are incredibly important, and I don't know of anyone who would consider emancipation a bad thing for the Jews when we compare it to what we were looking at in the Middle Ages. So generally, the counter-reform movement acknowledged that emancipation was a good thing, and they acknowledged the importance of the opportunities presented by the emancipation. But they were also incredibly aware of the challenges presented by modernity. So counter-reform's perspective on modernity and the emancipation and the Enlightenment and the changes that it brought was that emancipation was good, that modernity should be accepted and adapted to wherever it leads to Jewish health, happiness, and well-being. Most counter-reform leaders and thinkers agreed that the ghettos of the Middle Ages were not blessed. There was no particularly more authentic, it wasn't more authentically Jewish to live in ghettos and be persecuted than it is to live in freedom and be a citizen. That much of the lifestyle of the Middle Ages was not tradition, it was forced upon the Jews. So it was externally motivated by anti-Semitic law. So anything within the Jewish communities that was motivated purely by anti-Semitic laws were not good for the Jews and could be left behind in modern times. But at the same time, some level of separateness is divinely mandated by Torah or by the Bible. So counter-reform leaders wanted to find a way to balance this, the giving up of the oppressive isolation, but to maintain some sort of separation and autonomy. Modernity was understood to possibly be a very good thing for the Jews, but also it was acknowledged that modernity holds a lot of temptations that could lead to the failure of the Jewish community to uphold the covenant, and that could potentially lead to the extinction of the Jews as a people. That why would we go through 1,000 years of persecution in the Middle Ages only to fumble now when we have opportunity for health and happiness? Why would we now abandon Judaism in the modern age? Because modernity is just too tempting. There's too much pleasure possible. There's too many opportunities. There's too much choice. And if we don't handle modernity right, Judaism could go extinct. So in general, counter-reform leaders saw the opportunities and they saw the challenges, and the forms of Judaism that come out of this, particularly modern Orthodoxy, is their attempt to accept the opportunities while ameliorating the damages of the challenges. Reformers and counter-reformers were both aiming to preserve Judaism, to make sure that Judaism survives in modernity. Reformers understood both the opportunities and the challenges of modernity as well. They felt that Jews would simply leave Judaism if Judaism couldn't respond to the necessities of modern life. So while counter-reform leaders accused reformers of trying to effectively abandon Judaism, in their own way, reformers were also trying to save Judaism and to ensure its continued survival in the modern age. So both of them had basically the same goals. We want to accept the opportunities of modernity, and we want to meet the challenges of modernity, and we want to make sure Judaism survives modernity. The counter-reform didn't necessarily recognize that those were the goals of the reformers. Their critiques of the reform movements had three general sort of trends to them. First, many counter-reform leaders simply called reformers heretics, that they were blaspheming, that they were committing harm to Torah and to the community, and many counter-reform leaders simply excommunicated or banned reformers in their midst. Secondly, many counter-reform leaders accused reformers of having selfish motivations, that the reformers are saying that they're doing this for Judaism, but really they're doing it out of their own desire for pleasure, their own greed for profit, for ambition in secular careers or the secular world, a desire to satisfy their own ego and pride, and out of laziness, that they're simply too lazy to maintain proper Judaism. So first, reformers were heretics. Second, reformers had selfish motivations. And thirdly, many counter-reform leaders simply said that the reformers did not have the authority to make the wide-sweeping changes they were making. That reformers simply didn't have the authority to vacate Torah, that they did not have the authority to question the Talmud. They did not have the authority to make the changes they were making. The other sort of big critique, which is more of a question, so I haven't listed it in here, but the other big thing is the critique of the necessity of those changes. Were these changes necessary? Why are you making them? Can we find more traditional ways to meet the challenges and opportunities of modernity? Why do you have to go so far? And this is really the feeling of the counter-reform, is that the reform movement simply is just going too far. They're making unnecessary changes. They're making changes for change's sake. And that is simply inconsistent with Judaism. Yes, Rabbinic Judaism can change with the times, but we're not supposed to change for the sake of change. And many counter-reformers simply argued, if civil authorities are giving us freedom of religion, then we shouldn't have to make certain changes that the reformers want us to make. Which, if you think about it, is still an active discussion going on in Judaism today. Freedom of religion, within the umbrella of freedom of religion, should Jews still change their practices if they have freedom of religion? Particularly in contrast to the Jews of the Middle Ages, who did not have religious freedom and stayed steadfast to tradition, even if it cost them their lives. So the counter-reform movement simply questioned the necessity of the reform in the face of emancipation. Not all reforms, and we'll see that orthodoxy, modern orthodoxy, neo-orthodoxy, and neologism, which are movements we'll look at today, they all came with their own reforms in light of modernity. Okay, one of the big questions that comes throughout this is, like, who has the authority to make these changes? And for this, it's important to look at the sources of authority in Judaism traditionally. Now, I haven't added this to the list, but it's a pretty important one as well. There is also non-Jewish authority. The non-Jewish authority has had a particular importance in Judaism throughout the Great Diaspora. Jews have had to live under other peoples, under other religions, under other authorities. So the role of non-Jewish authority has played a role in Judaism for the past 2,000 years. It is probably one of the major things that prevented Judaism from gaining a strong tradition of missionary work, for example. Judaism may have had some Jews historically have taken "you will be a light unto the nation" as a missionary obligation for Judaism. But of course, for a good 1,000 years or so, Jews were actually legally prohibited from seeking converts, and in fact were obligated to reject converts. And this has become sort of the trend within Rabbinic Judaism today, is that Judaism is a closed tradition. It doesn't seek converts. And some forms don't particularly welcome converts either, with the tradition of rejecting converts the first few times that they ask you to convert. Has come about there. So I haven't added that to the list, but it is something to keep in mind, that non-Jewish authority is understood to be a valid authority within Judaism. We'll look more at the role of non-Jewish authority, I think, over the next, class 23, we'll look at that. But within traditional Judaism, you have 5 major sources of authority within rabbinic Judaism. First is God, and by extension of God, his prophets, the people who speak for God. Secondly, textual authority, and this is, of course, Torah, but within traditional rabbinic Judaism, this also includes Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch. If you can remember that from Unit 2, that is the official sort of codification of rabbinic law, and the Shulchan Aruch becomes the foundation, the foundational code of Orthodox Judaism. Third, ancestral, parental, communal authority, or minhag, effectively, the way that our elders did it, the way we were taught to do things. Fourth, ongoing rabbinic authority, halakha, of course, the ability of rabbis to apply the law, to explain the law, and to make adjustments to the law as needed. And fifth, personal authority. Personal authority has always been a source of authority in Judaism. Judaism doesn't necessarily have a really strong tradition of mandating every little aspect of personal faith. So there's always been an element of personal authority within people's Judaism. With the emphasis on education has always come this belief that Jews need to be well educated so Jews can make intelligent, educated decisions about their own Judaism and the Judaism of their children. Jewish ethics has always been a matter of personal thought processes. Yes, you learn what the rabbis teach and you read rabbinic sources, but ultimately your ethics are in your hands because you're the only person who witnesses everything that you do other than God. So your ethics are ultimately your personal decisions. But with modernity, obviously personal authority becomes much more central. Jewish education, secular education, come together to make people who are functionally more able to make decisions about their ethics, their personal beliefs, and their ritual. And it is in ritual that essentially where modern Judaism diverges, that there is so much personal authority within how you practice Judaism. That's a bit of an innovation because traditionally Judaism did not have a lot of room for personal choice in practice, but now we do. Okay, so when you're looking at the counter-reform in Europe, you're actually looking at dozens and dozens of figures that contributed to the counter-reform. The Mitnagdim, the opposers to Hasidism back in the 1700s, kind of started what would become the counter-reform, even though the Mitnagdim were not counter-reform, they were in fact counter-Hasidic. They established the process for arguing against innovation effectively. And as we looked at the very end of Unit 2, the minhag of the Gra, the minhag of the Vilna Gaon, becomes essentially the foundation of a lot of modern orthodoxy, the way of the Vilna Gaon. Now, the Mitnagdim makes their peace with the Hasids, particularly in light of the Reform. So it's the Mitnagdim married with the Hasidic movement in the 1800s and beyond that becomes one of the really powerful streams of the counter-reform. Another major figure, Azrael Hildesheimer, how best to describe this? There are multiple forms of orthodoxy, which may actually seem counterintuitive. You would think, well, if they're the Orthodox, then they're the Orthodox and they should be solidified. They aren't. There are multiple forms of orthodoxy. Azrael Hildesheimer brought forth what he called cultured orthodoxy. He was a German rabbi, and he was one of the founders he called his movement cultured orthodoxy, but he is now considered to be one of the founders of modern orthodoxy. He was in total agreement with emancipation, absolute total agreement with emancipation, and to some extent the Enlightenment, that science is not incompatible with Judaism. Secular career is not incompatible with Judaism. A good, solid secular education not incompatible with Judaism. His form of cultured orthodoxy embraced secular education, it embraced science, it embraced philosophy, it embraced being a good neighbor with non-Jews, it embraced all of the benefits of modernity, but not at the cost of faith and not at the cost of tradition. So a good Jewish education was just as important as a good secular education, and while these things are not incompatible, they had to be balanced. But yet he was also criticized by people who considered themselves more orthodox than he was. He was criticized as a reformer by more conservative critics. So this is not simply a reformers over here and orthodoxy over here. There's lots of conflict going on in between as well. And one person's orthodox is another person's reformer, I guess. So there are lots of events and lots of moments that we could look at, but again, I'm trying to simplify this for you. So I've sort of selected a few leaders that became crucial to the movement, and one of these leaders is Moshe Sofar. And the reason he is important, he was the rabbi of Pressburg, who effectively, he was so counter-reform that he effectively, during his lifetime, effectively kept the reform movement out of Pressburg. He was so adamant against the reform movement. And he leveraged the practice, the laws in Europe that up to that point said that there could only be one rabbi per region or city, one congregation. There could be only one congregation, and he leveraged that. And he encouraged other Orthodox counter-reform rabbis to leverage that as well, to bar Reform Judaism from establishing congregations and from establishing leadership in various places. And Moshe Sofar is considered to be one of the central founders of what is now described as ultra-Orthodoxy, as well as Orthodoxy. He was a major figure in the creation of Orthodoxy and in the Counter-Reform. But now, retrospectively, he's considered to be one of the founders of the ultra-Orthodox movement. And probably one of the most visible activities, because he didn't actually publish all that much. He didn't leave a lot of writings, but he was powerful in terms of his influence on other counter-reformers. And he was one of the biggest figures at one of the biggest events, the Universal Israelite Congress of Hungary of 1868 to 69. And this is the event that basically leads to what we call the Hungarian Schism, which sounds kind of epic. And it kind of is from a theological standpoint. It probably isn't as dramatic as the name sounds from other standpoints. But this is effectively the moment when Hungarian Jews had to choose. Remember, only one congregation per region, one rabbi per region, one congregation per city. Laws of the time prevented multiple congregations from being established. And the Jews had to choose. Now, it wasn't just about the law. The Jews also wanted to stay unified because Jews have always historically remained as unified as possible. So they had to obey the law that said there could only be one congregation, but they also had a higher cultural law that said that Jews need to remain unified. So the Orthodox or counter-reformists met with a group referring to themselves as the Neologues. Neologues they're reformers, but they're actually closer to conservative Judaism. So they didn't want to go as far as reformers did in Germany, and certainly not as far as reformers were doing in America. But they definitely wanted to modernize their Judaism, and they wanted to go closer to reform than the Orthodox counter-reformers were interested in going. So this was a conference. The United Israelite Congress was effectively a congress of sort to come up with some sort of compromise that would allow the Orthodox Jews of Hungary and the Neologues of Hungary to hold a congregation together. And Sofer was one of the biggest figures there. And he proposed, along with others, he proposed that the Orthodox Jews could coexist with Neologue Judaism as long as the Neologues agreed that the Shulchan Aruch was the basic foundational requirements of rabbinic Jews. The Neologues could not. They refused. They said the Shulchan Aruch is a codification from the 1500s. We are modern Jews. We need our own codes. We need our own modernized practices. We cannot continue to live in the Middle Ages. And because the Neologues refused to accept the supremacy of the Shulchan Aruch, the Orthodox Jews and the Neologues of Hungary could not form a congregation together, and effectively the rift was not healed. Eventually, Jews gained the right to start their own congregations. And this is sort of a pivotal moment, this desire to find compromise and this once and for all answer, like the once and for all rejection of the Shulchan Aruch, which effectively becomes doctrine for most Reform congregations, is that the Shulchan Aruch is a tremendously important historical document, but it reflects medieval Judaism. It doesn't reflect modern Judaism. And it's at this point effectively when you can say that Orthodoxy and even conservative Jews in Europe are going their own separate ways. And now another leader of the Orthodoxy movements, or the counter-reform, that I want to touch upon today is Samson Raphael Hirsch. And I have a soft spot for Hirsch because the first university paper, I think, that I did on Judaism was a deep reading of Samson Raphael Hirsch. And I've always had a soft spot for him, so I always include him in courses. But he's also, that's objectively, he's also really important. He founded what he called neo-orthodoxy. Now, he was attempting to distinguish himself from reformers, but in many ways he was also attempting to distinguish himself from other forms of orthodoxy, which is really interesting because Samson Raphael Hirsch also rejected the idea of denominationalism. He said there are no denominations, there's simply Judaism and non-Judaism. So what we have to do is find the right permutation of Judaism that all Jews can be a part of, and then we will end the era of denomination and we'll simply be Jews or not Jews again. So it's that attitude or that goal is kind of ironic considering he started his own form of orthodoxy. But he also advocated for secessionism, which is kind of denominational heavy. Secessionism effectively says that you have the right and perhaps even the obligation to leave your congregation if your congregation is not following Judaism correctly. You have the right and perhaps the obligation to establish your own congregation if your version of Judaism is more correct than what is being practiced in your congregation. And he did this. He's established a synagogue on Frankfurt am Main, and he established it as neo-Orthodox which effectively is a counter-reform denomination that he felt went further to embrace education. He felt that his denomination was essentially modern. And in fact, he felt that there was no incompatibility between modernity and Judaism, that Judaism was essentially a modernity-friendly tradition, that we Jews have always had a tradition of critical thinking and has always been pro-science, that really it was anti-Semitism that kept Jews from modernizing, not Judaism itself. So he simply was presenting a new form of a new phase in what he felt was already traditional Judaism's strengths in terms of modernity. So his form of orthodoxy presented itself as a coalescence, I guess, between Judaism and modernity. He advocated for universal education for both boys and girls, men and women, in terms of both religious education and secular or academic education. So this is pretty advanced egalitarianism, really. He had advocated that rabbis should give sermons, and they should give sermons in the vernacular. So if you're in Berlin, if you're a rabbi in Berlin, you ought to be offering sermons in German, because this adds to the general Jewish knowledge and understanding amongst your congregation, which is important. And he also advocated in that rabbis and Jewish leaders should write books in the vernacular as well, because that way Jews who spoke that language could read them, but also non-Jews could read them, which could also develop understanding. It could develop tolerance. Better understanding is always good, right? It is a universal good, according to Hersch, and I think according to me. The stronger your understanding, the safer, healthier, more advanced your society. And he also advanced, for this purpose, he also advanced the importance of secular academic education for rabbis. So effectively, he argued that rabbis should go out, get an undergraduate education in psychology or German literature or philosophy, and then take advanced studies in rabbinics, which is pretty advanced. That's pretty modern thinking. And he felt none of these things were incompatible with Judaism, that Judaism easily allows for modernization without compromising itself, because all of those nuts and bolts are already there. Judaism has a long history of welcoming education and stressing education, and there's nothing in Judaism that prohibits modernization. Now, Hersch's major ideological advancement is what he has referred to as Torah im Derech Eretz, Torah in the way of the land. So you remain Jewish, you keep Torah, and you walk in the way of the lands in which you live. Beautiful is the study of Torah with Derech Eretz, the way of the land or path, as involvement with both makes one forget sin. So walk in the land that you're in and keep Torah. This is sort of a foundation stone of modern orthodoxy. You live where you're living, and you make that life where you're living. You accept non-Jewish neighbors, and you accept the good of the non-Jewish world, but you keep Torah. Judaism for Hersch is not a part of life, it is life itself. So you simply practice your Judaism as you walk in the land. It should be harmonized with your lifestyle in all ways, but that doesn't exclude you from accepting emancipation. Judaism allied with progress is how he described neo-Orthodoxy. So his principles of neo-orthodoxy was that emancipation and secular education, including vernacular languages and the sciences, must be embraced by Jews, as this is central to accessing security, prosperity through a successful career, as well as securing livelihood. He advocated that poverty is not a blessed status. Ghettos, oppression, those are man-made. Those are created by anti-Semites, not by God. And those things should be left behind. Poverty, ghettos, oppression, isolation, all of the health and social issues that go along with segregation, those should be left behind because they're man-made, not God-made. And Orthodox Jews are not obligated to remain ghettoized. Second, that wide, high quality education should be offered to everyone because they can augment religious education, they can augment Jewish identity, can contribute to our lives as Jews, especially broader literacy, that reading widely outside of Judaism can actually improve our religious study. It can improve our Judaism. Judaism was never meant to be isolated. If we look to Babylon, the early rabbis, after the development of Islam, rabbis and Muslim authorities worked together really intensely to the benefit of both Judaism and Islam. So effectively he doesn't use that historical example, but he sees within Judaism the potential value of reading widely, reading outside of Judaism. Thirdly, traditional Judaism is in no way incompatible with modern life. Things that make Jews distinct from other people need to be maintained because we are a nation of priests. But Judaism is not incompatible with modern life. Integration is not incompatible with Judaism. We are also to be a light unto the nations. And Judaism doesn't prohibit anything of modern life. So what he's basically saying are those goals that the reformers have, these aren't incompatible with traditional Judaism. So we can maintain traditional Judaism and still meet the goals of the reformers. So I just want to give a shout out to one of Hirsch's books that I do encourage you to look at, and this is the 19 Letters. And it's a really good example of Hirsch, not only his feelings about orthodoxy, but the way that he lived his neo-orthodoxy. Hirsch was very well educated. He was university educated. He was highly literate in German, and he produced the 19 Letters in perfect German. And this is a very well presented defense of Jewish traditionalism. It's meant to be read by Jews, individual Jews weighing the pros and cons of reform, and it's meant to defend traditional Judaism for those people so they can get the sense that you can embrace modernity and remain traditional. And it also, quite oddly enough, also became a lot of non-Jews read it as well. It's probably his most famous work, and probably one of the most famous works to come out of the 1800s in terms of rabbinic literature. It's online to read if you are interested. You can find it at Sefaria. Also, if you're still searching for a final paper topic, something you might want to consider, one of the 19 Letters. Okay, so modern orthodoxy is what wins out. So we have neo-orthodoxy and neolog and cultured orthodoxy. Modern orthodoxy refers to the denomination that effectively comes out of that middle path of Judaism. So it is a term that describes conservative schools or traditional schools of modern Judaism that grow out of the Counter-Reform. It's a balance between reform, or as the reformers saw it, and the rejection of modernity for the sake of tradition. Effectively, the rule of thumb for modern orthodoxy is change for change's sake is unnecessary. We still have to work within the accepted authorities of God and his prophets, Torah and rabbinic authority, and we have to maintain continuity with the minhag of our elders. Within modern orthodoxy, the Talmud and Torah remain central, and as does the Shulchan Aruch as a foundational document. So therefore, textual authority is a stronger force within orthodoxy. Simply put, for modern Orthodox Jews, progress that breaks Torah is not really progress. It's actually a step back from what we're supposed to be doing as Jews, which is keeping the covenant. And the principal sort of ideology, the principal outlook of modern Orthodoxy is Torah Umada, Torah and knowledge. So a secular academic education is absolutely valid and it needs to be encouraged. Secular academic education supports Judaism. It leads to a better life, healthier, happier, more fulfilled Jews and Jewish families. It raises healthier, more stable Jewish children. It improves the quality of life amongst the community and therefore makes for stronger communities. And in fact, as I think Hersh points out, for some you could argue that it's actually our obligation, particularly as parents, to access a strong secular education so we can provide a better life for our children. So for many modern Orthodox Jews, secular education and a good livelihood is actually a religious obligation. But Torah in all of this, you do not abrogate Torah or vacate Torah simply to access secular education and a secular lifestyle. You put them together because there is no Jewish aspect of life and the rest of life. There is only a Jew's life. Judaism is not simply a part of life, it is life. And Torah and knowledge is about balancing those two goods, right? I have placed a link below and here, which will give you a little snippet of how Orthodoxy views denominationalism. And it really talks about the relationship between Jews and Jews in Orthodox circles. How we deal with diversity. That is one of the challenges of modernity that Judaism has faced as well, is how, not only how Jews can relate to non-Jews, but how Jews can relate to other Jews. How Jews can deal with denominationalism and diversity within Judaism, because there is no putting that genie back in the bottle. Like, we are at the point where this is the state of Judaism currently. Okay, so we've only touched a little bit on Haredi Judaism, and I'm not going to go on and on about it because it's not my area of specialty. I have very little experience with Haredi Judaism, but effectively Haredi Judaism is what most people describe as ultra-Orthodox. And this is those Judaisms that grow out of Sofer's leadership, that grow out of the marriage between the Mignagdim and the Hasidism. And those forms of Judaism that are critical of both reformers and the majority of the counter-reform. Haredi Judaism or ultra-Orthodox rejected the middle path of modern Orthodoxy or Neo-Orthodoxy because they considered those as too much. They considered leaders like Hildesheimer and Hirsch as being reformers and not true to Judaism. Quite famously described as sort of new is forbidden by Torah, that Judaism will only need reformation when the Messiah comes, and even the Messiah doesn't have the authority to vacate Torah. So strict adherence to rabbinic tradition, particularly as the rabbinic tradition that we see in the 1600s and 1700s under the Vilna Gaon, that is the way Jews are supposed to live. There is no reformation that is authoritative. Jewish tradition is Torah, it is Talmud, it is Shulchan Aruch, and it is largely incompatible with modern life. And Jews are meant to live separately, and living separately, living in the sort of isolation, self-imposed isolation of the Middle Ages is how Jews survive. It's how Jews practice Judaism correctly. And not just separation from non-Jews, but also separation from Jews who are less observant. So it's not simply be a nation of priests by rejecting non-Jewish influence. It's also be a nation of priests by rejecting what they might consider lesser Jews' influence. Now, this is not to say that Haredi Judaism is unwelcoming to what is referred to as returnees. Jews who seek entrance into ultra-Orthodoxy, no matter how they're raised, are often welcomed into Haredi Judaism. And in many cases, Haredi Jews actually practice outreach to other Jews, to Reformed Jews, or Orthodox Jews, or conservative Jews, or Jews that they consider to be less observant than them. And in many cases, Haredi Judaism is the only Judaism, one of the only Judaisms that actually has a strong conversionary zeal, but it's directed at other Jews, not at non-Jews. It's complicated, so we'll leave it there. So there is an emphasis on Jewish education as the priority, the only priority. And a suspicion of forms of knowledge that may disrupt faith and tradition, and forms of knowledge that are simply considered to be unnecessary to living a full Jewish life. Now, earning a living is a basic need. It's a basic human need. So some secular training is unavoidable. But it's not always desirable. Now, this will vary from family to family, but when we get to the more strict side of the Haredi spectrum, more secular education or training than is absolutely necessary is not desirable, because secular education can be seen as essentially damaging to faith, to practice, to priorities. It's not necessary to develop a full, authentic, conservative Jewish lifestyle, and therefore it has more potential for harm than for good. And again, not all Haredi families will feel this way. Some Haredi families will encourage secular education alongside of a Jewish education, but some don't. And unfortunately, amongst Haredi Jews, this is often quite gendered. Many Haredi Jewish families will encourage secular education more amongst their sons than they would amongst their daughters, for example. Again, though, this is far more complex than I can present here. But the emphasis here is on Jews as nation of priests, not so much on the nation Jews as a light to other nations. and an emphasis on separation and a continuation, or what they believe to be the authentic continuation of medieval rabbinic Judaism. It's not, of course. It develops like all of the others. It develops out of an interaction with modernity. Only this one effectively develops out of a rejection of modernity, or at least a rejection of the reform entirely. Whereas modern orthodoxy embraced some of the goals of the reform and offered an alternative path to modernity, Haredi Judaism are those counter-reform movements that simply rejected the reform altogether. So I do have about a 9-minute clip. It's an American news clip on people raised within Haredi communities and their experiences. Take it with a grain of salt. Remember that even amongst the Haredi there is a lot of diversity, but I wanted to give you some sort of idea, some glimpse into this community, because it's not a really well understood community. And there are challenges involved for people raised as Haredi Jews who leave that community and enter modern life. So I would like you to look at that clip, but do take it with a grain of salt. Okay. So the counter-reform in America. Now, there are Haredi communities in America. Actually, America is home to some of, I think, the majority of Haredi Jews. I haven't looked up those stats in a while, though, so I think there's sort of a toss-up between Israel and America, but I think the U.S. is home to the majority of Haredi Jews. But those Jews, Haredi communities, are largely transplants. I'm not... when we talk about the counter-reform in America, we're largely talking about modern Orthodoxy, or some people actually refer to as American Orthodoxy, because America... we can't just talk about reform in America. We have to talk about American reform, because it views itself as different. It responds to different historical events and stimuli. So American Orthodoxy is one of the major counter-reform movements in the United States. The Orthodox Union, which is essentially an organization meant to represent Orthodox synagogues or congregations in the States, that was established in 1898. And Yeshiva University was established in 1915 as an Orthodox Jewish university. Now, when we talk about the counter-reform in America, it is perhaps the most famous form of counter-reform in America is the development of the conservative movement. Now, outside of the United States, conservative Jews refer to themselves as Masorti, but conservative Judaism is kind of essentially an American movement. It's all about choice, right? You can either be reform or counter-reform, but that doesn't just mean reform or orthodox. For Americans, there also had to be a third way. And for conservative Jews, they might argue that they are really the middle path between the more conservative end of the spectrum and the more reform or progressive side of the spectrum. So conservative Judaism is an American movement originally. It was founded by, it was influenced by the counter-reform in Europe, but it grows essentially in the United States. Particularly as a rejection, to be honest, it's particularly a rejection of Isaac Mayer Weiss, who we looked at last week, particularly after the Treifa banquet. There were a couple of things that conservative Jews just simply could not accept. The loss of Hebrew, for example, the loss of the kosher laws, the embrace or even the suggestion of embracing intermarriage. These were things that the conservative Jews in the United States could not accept. So they didn't see themselves as Orthodox, but they couldn't accept some of the reforms of the reform movement, or American reform. So they began the conservative movement. Accept modernity, accept the opportunities of America, but don't accept them at the expense of faith and necessary tradition. And the word necessary there is pretty important, because conservative Jews believe that you should examine each Jewish tradition and not just accept tradition for tradition's sake, or accept change for change's sake. And this is because conservative Judaism is heavily influenced by Zacharias Frankel's positive historical Judaism movement out of Europe. And this is about embracing, being history positive, embracing Judaism as a civilization, embracing Jewish history, and knowing the history of how Judaism develops so that you can better understand the religion. Therefore, you can better determine what is original or necessary within Judaism from what was simply a fragment or an artifact of historical change or historical necessity. So the scientific study of Judaism can augment Jewish life, it can augment Jewish identity, and it puts more control over Judaism in the hands of Jews. So positive historical Judaism embraces Wissenschaft des Judentums. It embraces academic, scientific study of Judaism. It embraces biblical criticism. It embraces all of those things as tools. It will strengthen individual identity, individual faith and practice. It'll strengthen the community, and it'll allow for the careful assessment of each proposed modernization and each proposed tradition, I guess, or each tradition that people propose to keep. One of the things that makes the conservative movement so American is that for many cases, the conservative within conservative Judaism, each congregation has autonomy from other congregations. So you will get a lot of diversity amongst conservative Judaism, because of the belief that the congregation has the right to examine each change and each tradition for their own value. And so we have in conservative movement a counter-reform, but in a way an alternative reform as well, and has given us one of the big innovations that we see within modern American Judaism, and has actually spread to other denominations as well. And this is the movement towards Havara study, Havara meaning fellowship. So these are small study fellowship groups, usually amongst peers. So you can find other Jews of your age or gender or political affiliation, or who share similar hobbies or have something in common, to study Judaism and to give people the tools to drive their own Judaism. And this allows for egalitarianism, it allows for personal comfort, it allows for personal choice, and it generally, amongst the conservative congregations, it emphasizes the preservation of rituals, especially amongst young people, by giving young people the education to understand their own Judaism, to understand the rituals, and in many cases, to DIY their rituals. So the Havara movement is kind of conservative in that it promotes the preservation of traditional rituals, but it's also kind of counterculture. And it really hits its stride in the 60s, 70s because of its counterculture uses. So it starts as conservative. It doesn't stay there. There are now actually independent, non-affiliated Havara groups as well, that allow people to put themselves in the driver's seat of their own Judaism. Kind of also quite American. The other thing that grows out of the conservative movement that we really need to touch here is Reconstructionist Judaism. So Reconstructionist Judaism has its roots in positive historical Judaism, and as a result, or by extension, Wissenschaftes Judentum, and in the conservative Jewish movement in America. And it was founded by Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan. And very importantly, his book, Judaism as Civilization. Remember way back in week 1 when we talked about the different ways we can define Judaism? One of those definitions was Judaism is a civilization. Kaplan is effectively arguing that whether or not you believe in God, you need to recognize that Judaism represents the civilization of the Jews that have been kept together through shared identity, a shared common idea of origin, a shared God, shared texts, and a shared way of life. And that is the heritage of the Jews. Whether or not you believe in God doesn't change the fact that Judaism is your heritage. Law and minhag, these texts, these are valuable. And we need to start thinking of Judaism as whether or not it is valuable, not whether it is binding. You don't continue to practice Judaism because if you don't, God will be mad. Rather, practice Judaism because it is your heritage. People need to connect to their heritage. Heritage is valuable to people. So from Kaplan's perspective, study makes people better. It makes us happier, more fulfilled human beings to know about the world, to study both secular and religious topics. Jewish study connects Jews to their heritage, and heritage brings with it roots. It brings a sense of self. It brings a sense of community. So knowing about Jewish civilization can bring Jews pride. It can bring Jews a sense of belonging. It can bring Jews a sense of identity. And Jewish education allows for personal decisions on beliefs and practices, not because you need to determine what will make God mad, but because you need to determine what is good for you, what is healthy for you. Losing your roots, losing a sense of the authentic, losing your heritage is not healthy. And embracing heritage, embracing the authentic is important. So Reconstructionist Judaism is about making sure Jews know enough about their Judaism to effectively work it. You need to read the instruction manual for your Judaism so that you can operate it effectively. And this is where Reconstructionist Judaism comes in. Reconstructionist Judaism is also essentially or inherently egalitarian. Mordecai Kaplan's daughter Judith was the first bat mitzvah in recorded history. In March 1922, he bat mitzvah, of course, the female version of the bar mitzvah. And again, rituals have value for yourself. They have value for your community. It's not simply rooted in a supernatural God. It's also rooted in what's beneficial for you. And it's beneficial for us to have rites of passage and rituals and family rituals and communal rituals to provide a sense of self, a sense of identity, to cultivate ethics and to cultivate pride in ourselves. Now, this is a very different goal, because remember, for many of these counter-reformers, and I do consider Mordecai Kaplan in some ways a counter-reformist, even though his goals may sound pretty modern. He is still advocating against the wholesale loss of the kosher laws and Sabbath and things like bar mitzvahs, because he's saying the rituals have value and should not just simply be cast out for the sake of modernizing. So I do consider Mordecai Kaplan a counter-reformist. But he's a great example of how the counter-reform had multiple different goals. It's important to recognize that many counter-reform Jewish leaders felt the power, felt the weight of the covenant as a collective obligation. So for many of these counter-reform leaders, they couldn't simply say, well, whatever, you do your Judaism, I don't care. I'll do my Judaism, you do your Judaism. That was a luxury that many counter-reform leaders didn't really feel they had, because they felt that the covenant was a collective obligation. It's important how other Jews practice their Judaism. It's important that Judaism be preserved on a communal level, not simply at an individual level. It's important for the preservation of Judaism, and it's also important for the upholding of the covenant, because we've seen throughout Jewish history, many events in Jewish history are effectively explained by, well, the Jews angered God, they broke the covenant, and they were sent into exile in Babylon. Many counter-reform leaders felt the pressure of that. What fresh hell is the reform going to bring on all of our heads? Kaplan is not coming from that position. He's coming from a position of, you know what? Preserve your Judaism because it's a part of you and it's important, and it'll make you a better person. It'll make you a happier person. It'll make you a person with an authentic set of roots from which to grow. And this is both an essentially modern position, but it is also, in my opinion, a counter-reform position, just with different goals in mind. Okay? So these things are pretty complicated, and people are doing lots of different things for different motivations. It's really important to listen to how they describe their motivation. Okay, so I'm also linking for you some optional AV if you're interested. So next week we're going to be looking at postmodern, I guess next week, week 11, next Thursday. According to the calendar part of this week, but according to the syllabus, next week. Week 11, we'll be looking at postmodern Judaism, and then we'll be looking at the Holocaust, and then we will be looking at the modern state of Israel after that and into the test. But before we get there, if you don't know a lot about Jewish history during this phase, because a lot of people know the biblical stuff, some people know some of the main rabbis of the Middle Ages, but if you're hazy on the historical details leading up from the Reform and the Counter-Reform to the World Wars, I'm posting a documentary for you so that you can get a sense of that history. You can see how Judaism plays against the context of the world stage and all of the different changes that modernity is bringing, and how the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim move in from the last unit into this one before we get to later modern stuff like the Holocaust. So I don't know, I think the whole of the documentary series Faith and Fate is on YouTube. If it is, I recommend the whole thing. But if you want to know more about the build up towards what is coming in this course, you can watch this episode, the first episode of Faith and Fate. It's optional, however. I am a firm believer that if you understand the history, the better you understand the history, the more sense a lot of this stuff will make. So I do encourage you to watch it, but you're not required to. Okay, so remember, we have our last final test coming up on December 7th. There is no final exam. And we have the final unit paper coming up on December 8th. That is, I think, literally the last day of classes. So I won't be moving the deadline on that one. I encourage you to just get ahead of that now. The instructions should already be on my learning space. I'll double check today, but I think they're already on my learning space. And then you have your final paper due by December 15th. No final exam, just your final paper. If you're, I am trying to catch up with the email that I was late on while I was sick, but email me if you need help with your final paper, and I will see what I can do. Okay, so your prompt for week 10 on the American Reform platforms. And that's it. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, please email me. Use the discussion forum to discuss this stuff with your classmates if you would like. Bye for now. I will see you on Thursday when we look at postmodern Judaism, which is eclectic and wild and very complicated, but we'll try our best. Okay? So I'll see you on Thursday. Bye for now.